Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Earthman. I am the president of the Rotary Club of Portland, and I would like to welcome you to our online video weekly membership meeting. So I feel it would be sort of tone deaf, especially as a Rotarian, if I did not acknowledge the violence and the protests included in our own city these past many days in the wake of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis and the ongoing racism and police brutality towards Black and Brown people in our country. Rotary is an international humanitarian service organization, and we are dedicated to 6 areas of focus to build international relationships, to improve lives, and create a better world to support our peace efforts. Rotary encourages conversations to foster understanding within and across cultures. So what I'm about to read is an excerpt from the Portland Rotaract Club that they posted on Sunday night to their social media channels. As a global institution that has made diversity and inclusion a top priority, we call on our fellow Rotaractors and Rotarians to not stay silent in the wake of these human catastrophes. We encourage each other to ask, how can my club do better? How can our members do better? How can our leadership do better? How can the institution as a whole do better? As a Rotaract club that advocates for inclusion in a very white city, we must be loud in our rejection of oppressive systems and in support of Black lives. We must educate ourselves, be in conversation with each other, lean into the uncomfortable work, and support Black lives. This is how change happens. That is how we stay united, and that is how we connect to each other. And I want to thank the Portland Rotaract Club for just presenting these questions for all of our membership to think about. And I hope for us to actually have some discussions with one another, as uncomfortable as that might be. I understand that there has been real property damage to the downtown business of a fellow Rotarian, and that can absolutely be a part of this conversation. While we also recognize that peace, along with conflict resolution, is one of the main focuses within Rotary. Thanks. Now, I'm just going to welcome any of our virtual guests. Thank you all for tuning into our weekly membership meeting. And would you believe it's June? It is June. I would like to extend a happy anniversary to everyone who became a Rotarian in the month of June. You can see the membership June anniversary list in the email that is sent along with the video link that you get right now. And it's also on our website under the header of membership. As always, my fellow Rotarians, looking at the anniversary list, it's a great way to help you decide which fellow Rotarian you're going to check in with this week, especially because you will have that opportunity to say happy anniversary to them and to thank them for their years of service above self. Now, each month, we highlight one of our committees, and for the month of June, it is our Youth Exchange Committee. Please welcome Rotarian David Knoll to tell you about the work that the committee is involved with.
Thank you, Kate. The Youth Exchange Committee runs the Youth Exchange program for our involvement in the Portland Public School. Rotary runs one of the largest high school level exchange programs, not only in the United States, but really in the world. And it is the Youth Exchange Committee's responsibility to screen and select our outbound students, as well as screen and select our host families for our inbound students. We also secure a position for each of our inbound students at one of the Portland Public School high schools. And this requires quite a bit of paperwork. Each student has to submit their transcript. They have to pass a special language test, which looks at both verbal and nonverbal English skills. And so it takes quite a bit of time to get that done. For each inbound student, we provide a student counselor as well as a host family counselor to help with any questions which might arise during the student's exchange. We also pay various school-related as well as program-related expenses and a monthly allowance for each one of our inbound students, and that amounts to, by the time we're done, about $4,500 a year it costs for us to maintain one of our inbound students. Each of our outbound students, we also select each of them, we recruit them, we screen them, and then they go through a training program put on by the District 5100, which we also, our club pays for. We cover all of the expenses and of those expenses, as well as we help with the travel and some of the activity expenses which are incurred during their exchange, to the tune of about $6,000 a year per student, which makes the Rotary outbound exchange program the low-cost program really in high school exchange programs. And it allows a lot of students who otherwise would not be able to go on an exchange for financial reasons to participate. We require each of our outbound students to buy an open return airfare ticket, which means if there's a problem, as there did turn out to be this year, they can just go to the airport and they can get on a plane. They already have the ticket and that's all done. We brought our 3 outbound students, one from Chile, one was in Chile, one Brazil, and one in Thailand. We brought them all home during March and April. In the past, we have sponsored, this past year, we sponsored, as I say, 3 long-term outbound students and 1, I should say exchanges, because for every outbound, we also have an inbound student. So we had 3 long-term exchanges over the school year and 1 short-term exchange, which occurs over the summer. As I said, we brought our 3 outbound students home early, and our 3 inbound students, we had 1 from Italy, 1 from India and Mexico. We had 1 occurrence which was quite unusual for us. It's not happened before. We actually had to send 1 of our students home early. He just turned out to be not mature enough to really participate fully in the exchange. It wasn't working out, so he went home early. Ananya, who was our inbound from India, was stranded here because of the lockdown for several weeks. Her family was stranded in different places in India as well. She did finally manage to get on one of the first planes sponsored by the Indian government, and she went home about 3 weeks ago. She recently finished her 2-week time in quarantine, and she's now staying with her grandparents, waiting for her parents to get a travel permit so they can come and pick her up in Hyderabad, which is about 900 miles away from where she actually lives. Our Mexican inbound, Jessica, is still with us, and she will be staying with us until June 20th, and we hope to have her next week give her talk about her experiences. So next year, we had planned for the 2022 year, our biggest exchange program ever, with 5 long-term outbounds and 4 short-term four short-term exchanges, 5 long-term exchanges. Rotary International is going to announce in the next week or 2 whether there will be any exchanges at all. A number of foreign countries have already canceled. And so it looks like we may not have an exchange this next year, but there's still going to be lots to do. We're always looking for new members. Even though we may not have a program, we will still be looking to maintain our relationships with our high schools, building those relationships with the administration, as well as recruiting and finding both outbound students and host families. Some of our students who were scheduled to go this year, if they don't go this year, they will be offered preference to go next year. So hopefully we'll see what happens with that. Our program, our committee is different in that in order to fully become involved in our committee, you have to go through a training program. You have to pass, which is sponsored by the North American Youth Exchange Network. And you have to pass a background test, and you have to have 3 personal references in order to become a certified volunteer and actually work with the students themselves. So hopefully we will have a program, at least if not this year, in the coming year, and we still have a lot of work to do during the summer. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that update. I had been wondering. I know we had spoken on one of our committee quick chats about it, but that was definitely more of an update than when I last spoke to you a couple of weeks ago. So that is good to know that what is the current status of everyone that has been involved, all the students that have been involved, and I look forward to hearing from Jessica next week. I'm hoping she can make it and participate and give us kind of her insight of her experience these past few months here in not her home country. So thank you again, David. All right, now please welcome, well, actually, fellow Rotarians, please welcome, and again, honored guests, please welcome, on behalf of the Rotary Club of Portland, it is my privilege to welcome a new member today, but a little different today in that I can say that I am overjoyed to welcome back today's new member, Ter Goldman. Terry, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, President Kate. And that's the first time I've been able to call you that in a Rotary meeting. So thank you for your leadership this year. It has been inspirational. I've been following the meetings since you've been back online, and you are a big reason why I am so happy to be rejoining this club and just thrilled to be back. So hi, everybody. My name is Ter Goldman. I'm the Vice President of Operations for Merite Hotel Management Company, a third-party hotel management company based in Springfield, Oregon. Last year, I sadly had to leave our club because my job took me on the road 90% of the time. In the era of COVID-19, my job is now from my home. And so I kept my home in the Portland area in Washington County, and look forward to participating in the online meetings and seeing you all as soon as we're able to reconvene back at the Sentinel Hotel, hopefully sooner rather than later. In addition to my role now as the Vice President of Operations with Merite Hotel Management, I'm now an independent health coach, and hopefully you see less of me because I've lost 29 pounds in the last 5-6 months, so really happy about that. I've missed you all, and I'm thrilled to be back, and I will be exploring committee opportunities and look forward to serving alongside you all, and just could not be happier to be back as a Rotarian with you all. So thank you, President Kate, and I'm thrilled to be back.
Thank you, Terry. I'm so thrilled that you were back as well. And I was actually going to ask you what committees are you thinking about? Because everybody's meeting online these days, and they would love to have you, kind of jump on in and see what they're up to.
Well, I think the committee that has come to my mind the most, and especially with the events of the last few days, is being a part of the Peace Builders Committee. So whoever the chair of the Peace Builders Committee is out there, look me up. I'd love to participate in learning more about your committee. And then I was a longtime member of the Preserve Planet Earth Committee. That's still near and dear to my heart. So probably those two committees to start, and looking at other opportunities as well.
It's great. That is great news. And I know they would both love to have you. And that's right. Just start slowly. I know there's so many opportunities in Rotary and so many things you could want to do and could do, and just, baby steps on in, you know how it goes. But again, I'm so glad you were back. So glad you're back. And I look forward to seeing you again in person, like you said, at the Sentinel when we all get back together in person. All right, everybody, please now welcome Rotarian Will Nolan as today's chair of the day.
Thanks, Kate, and welcome back, Terry. It's a pleasure to have you back here. I missed you very much. There is a program committee slot open if you should so choose to join us. I'll be the first one to make the plug. So hello, Rotarians and guests. I am very happy today to have Dr. Tim Duy from the University of Oregon here to discuss the ramifications of the shutting down of our economies due to the coronavirus and what a recovery might look like. Tim is a professor of practice and senior director of the Oregon Economic Forum at the U of O, and author of Tim Duy's FedWatch. And you may be wondering, as was I, what is a professor of practice? So I looked it up on the internet, of course. And according to the internet, it is someone who has actually worked in the real world and therefore has some practical experience in addition to all that book learning. And speaking of book learning, Tim has an undergrad degree, master's degree, and a PhD in economics to go along with his experience at the Treasury Department and an economic consultancy firm in Washington, D.C. He has been with the university since 2002 and produces statewide and regional economic indicators, indices, as well as the Central Oregon Business Index. In addition, he is a member of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors and the State Debt Policy Advisory Commission. But he is not just an Oregon treasure, as he is widely followed on Twitter and writes for or is quoted regularly in national press. I would encourage anyone who is interested in following in practical economics and following Tim to subscribe to his updates, which you can do right here. And with that, please help me welcome Dr. Tim Duy.
All right, well, thank you very much. Appreciate that introduction, Will. I'm going to share my screen so we can see my presentation. This usually goes fairly smoothly, but we'll see. Oh, the host. Can we change that? Siobhan? Or is she gone?
She might be there, but I don't know if she expected to do a share screen. So
okay.
I will message her in the background, and if you any introduction, just
so I will go ahead and start then, and we will then see if we get the slides up. So again, my name is Tim Duy. I am the director of the Oregon Economic Forum, professional practice. Thank you very much for that introduction. Also, thank you very much for joining me via video today. This has been an interesting and new experience that we're all sort of working our way through. And it's actually particularly interesting, I think, for economists right now. This is an unprecedented event. We certainly have never stopped the economy in this way. Back in February, it was really hard for me to imagine that we would be doing what we did. Even after seeing what happened in Italy, the whole idea that you could literally just shut down broad swaths of the US economy and do it very quickly really meant that there was going to be enormous amounts of economic damage. And to me, I guess, you know, in February, I would have still thought that the cost of that damage was going to outweigh any of the benefits that you're going to get out of it. Now, as the Italian situation emerged and got worse, and we saw other places in Europe get worse, obviously that calculus changed, and we decided we did need to, in fact, shut down large parts of the economy. This created a massive demand shock through the economy, and that has become fairly evident, I think, in many sectors. Initially, we were able to think about this in terms of a supply shock. So people were looking around over China and saying, okay, manufacturing industries will be shut down. Then our ability to produce in the US, it'll be fairly short-lived. There'll be a fairly quick bounce back. And maybe we'll even see some higher prices as a result. Now that whole story has certainly fallen apart. We know that this is more of a demand side issue than a supply side issue, simply because we told people they couldn't go out and spend any money. We basically now shut down the ability for people to buy goods and services. And when we did that, we shut down a lot of jobs at the same time. The damage started to happen fairly quickly. We were noticing, so this is also another little thing about this recession that's totally different than any other recession. There's no leading indicators for this recession. Usually, we could have this conversation a year in advance of a recession. We'd see some data start to deteriorate. We'd all sort of get together and debate whether a recession was really going to happen or not. Talk about policy responses that could prevent a recession. And we'd be tracking the data as it evolved to see if it actually became a recession. That certainly was very different this time. We basically knew we were in a recession before the data started showing us we were in a recession. And the hard part is that we're going to be out of a recession too before the data shows us that as well. So this is going to be a little bit of tricky space to read in the next few months to see exactly where the economy is at. So I titled this presentation, and if I had my slides, you could see that. I titled it The 3 Ds of Depression. Oh.
If you, Tim, if it's possible, I know you're right in the middle of all this, but if you can send these to Corinne, she just, in the chat column there, she just put down where you can send the presentation to her. She could present it. Seems that we can't switch you over midstream while we're doing
okay, that's fine. You know, probably easier at this point for me to just go through it, and I'll send you the slides, and then you can deliver it to your members. So I think that'll be the easiest way to go at this point. So the obvious immediate impact. So I call this 3 Ds of depression. So we call it depth, duration, and deflation, as thinking about 3 broad categories of economic outcomes that we would associate with depression. Mostly because this is the big topic that people have been talking about. How deep is this event? How long is this event going to last? And is it going to be something like the Great Depression? So depth really speaks to just the amount of the amount of the drop off in the economy. So the easiest way to see that is to see how many jobs were lost and how quickly unemployment rose. So unemployment went from 3.5% to 14.2% in a matter of months, 2 months. That's an amazing shift in economic activity. That never happens. We've never seen an increase in unemployment like that. And that reflects just the fact that we threw a bunch of people out of work all at once. That kind of depth is really consistent with what you think of as a recession. That's probably going to get worse in this next report too. And in fact, that unemployment report would have been worse had not a bunch of people dropped out of the labor force. So we're talking probably around 22%. Maybe more of the U.S. labor force suddenly became unemployed in March and April. And that's just an amazing shift in activity. We also see that kind of shift in other parts of data. I think the most recent data we had was consumption data for April. So we had that last Friday, and what we saw was a massive drop in spending, which of course should be expected. If you can't go out and buy anything, you can't spend anything. So part of what we had was, again, a manufactured recession. We chose to do this, and the data are showing us what we chose to do, that we chose to make it impossible for people to spend, and we chose to make it impossible for them to go to work, and the data is reflecting a lot of that. So that's the depth. And we think about the depth as probably a real depression type of event at this point. The next question is duration, right? How long does this last? Because there's a lot of difference between the Great Depression, the Great Recession, and some other recessions that were fairly short-lived. In 2001, we had a recession that lasted from March to November, right? So that's certainly a fairly short recession that wouldn't even begin to think of as a depressionary type event. So for us, we want to know, how long is it going to be before the economy starts to turn around? Well, there's a good chance the economy bottomed out in April, if not May. That we already hit the lowest point in the economy. An artifact of mathematics. For many firms, they shut down entirely in April and late March. They went to zero. Once you get to zero, that's by definition a bottom, right? So restaurant industry, for example, fell nearly to zero. Retail sales in many firms fell nearly to zero. Zero is a bottom. And once you're able to lift off from that bottom, you get fairly big increases in growth. Most people want to get back to work in some way, shape, or form, and really will work hard, I think, to try to accomplish that. So I think we're going to start to see by the end of this quarter and the beginning of next quarter, we'll start to see better data emerge. In today's report from the manufacturing sector, what we saw was an increase in new orders, increase in production, an increase in employment, right? They're all still at recessionary levels, but the direction's moving in the right way. Last week we saw a decrease in continuing unemployment insurance claims. So we still have a record level of initial unemployment claims. People are still losing their jobs, but they're losing their jobs at a slower rate, and they're starting to come off of unemployment insurance. And typically that's a leading indicator. Now, we still have a massive amount of people on unemployment insurance, but you can see how quickly the situation could turn as soon as we start to open up parts of the economy. So we'll probably get a bounce back in activity here later this year, but I don't think it's going to be a complete recovery. I think that's where we're getting into some real duration questions. How long does it take to completely recover the economy, and how much of a bounce do we get between now and that complete recovery? So in the near term, we're going to see a big bounce. If we make up 50, 60% of the gains, you know, that could take unemployment back down to 10%. Now, 10% is still unacceptably high, but the direction is the right direction. And a 10% unemployment rate would not be the depth that we consider depressionary. They'd be consistent with the worst of the Great Recession, excuse me, the last recession. So if we can make that kind of recovery and then probably slowly recover after that, that would put us, I think, in a better non-depressionary type of scenario. The problem with bringing on the economy altogether or bringing it back very quickly is that there's going to be a lot of damage going on to the economy right now, particularly in the small and mid-sized firm level. What we're seeing is some firms just simply aren't going to be able to operate with reduced capacity. So particularly in the leisure and hospitality industry, you can't, these are oftentimes firms that are operating on low margins to start with, and it's hard to see the amount of business being generated that will allow them to survive. So there's going to be probably churn in, say, the restaurant industry in particular. Many of those firms are always in the process of churn anyway, and that churn is going to accelerate. So anything that needs large numbers of densely packed people to operate is going to be a challenge to rebound quickly. And I think that's one of our big challenges here going forward until we start to learn how to grow the economy around the virus, which is what's going to happen eventually. It's just how long is that going to take to happen? So we know we have the depth. We might, I'm optimistic we won't quite have the duration. Not that there's going to be a V-shaped recovery per se, but it's not going to be a Great Depression type event where you have 30% unemployment rates for years on end. And then we also have to think about, well, are we going to get the deflation? Is that enough shock that we start to get the impact of lower prices that creates another hit to the economy? So when prices start to fall, tends to be that you're having a big enough shock that wages fall. And when wages fall, it becomes more difficult to finance your nominal debt load, right? So your wages fall, it becomes more difficult to finance your mortgage, right? And so that applies for individuals. It certainly applies for firms as well. That then prevents them from spending, encourages bankruptcies, makes the process of recovery more difficult. It can also cause people to defer spending. So if you think prices are going to be 5% lower next year, maybe you don't make a big purchase this year. So that would be the kind of scenario we don't want to end up in. And we've already had 2 months of negative prices, but that shouldn't be a big surprise at the front end of this. We're leaning on to prevent that deflation, lengthen and sort of make the duration of this shorter is fiscal and monetary policy support. So the Federal Reserve has cut interest rates to zero, and they've basically pulled out all of the stops in order to prevent financial markets from imploding. This is extremely important because if financial markets implode, it's going to be a shock that resonates back onto Main Street. This is very different than what we saw in the last two recessions. Those were shocks on Wall Street that fed into Main Street. This is a shock that was on Main Street, fed into Wall Street, and we're trying to prevent it from feeding back onto Main Street. That's really what the Federal Reserve is trying to do. I know from the point of view of the average person that it looks like they're not doing anything to help the little guy. Preventing the financial system from imploding is exactly what helps the little guy. We saw during the Great Depression what happens. Just let your finance explode. What happens when you let mass bankruptcies occur? We're trying not to recreate that experience. What's really interesting is the Federal Reserve has rolled out a bunch of lending programs. Some of those might not actually ever be used because the markets recovered before they could be actually implemented. basically in financial markets, just knowing that there was a backstop was enough to instill confidence to prevent the further slides. So that's, I think, important. We also know that stock markets have been foreshadowing a rise in output later this year. Certainly easy financial conditions, the likelihood that the economy did bottom in recently, and I think a flood of money flowing around in the system is all helping to support stock prices here going forward. So this is another thing that is very different than what we saw during the Great Depression. So that's been good. We've also had enormous amounts of federal fiscal support. So we've had tax rebates. We've had an enhancement of unemployment benefits so that some workers, in fact, a lot of workers are getting more unemployed than they were being employed. That's a program that's going to run out. So we'll have to talk about how we transition that into something maybe a little bit less generous. That's particularly an issue too for states that had low minimum wages. So states that had low minimum wages, once you gave an extra $600 a week, it was easy to get those state workers above their old pay. But it happened in Oregon too. I sort of ask any professional or anybody I've met that had come back to work to find out, you know, did they get more coming back to work or not? And so far it's like 50-50 of people who took a pay cut to come back to work and others who got a raise coming back to work. So it just depends what part of the system you're on. So we know that's happened. We also know there's a payroll protection plan that SBA loans, forgivable SBA loans, that also flooded into the system. Those, unfortunately, were not optimally designed. What we really needed was more generous support for firms that allowed them to pay their fixed costs, not necessarily their payrolls. So if they could pay their fixed costs, like their rent, capital costs, mortgages, then they could more easily survive this downturn and then push the employment costs onto the unemployment insurance system. So that program, they should have been more complementary instead of trying to make them substitutes for each other. So the intention, I think, was good, but the execution on that SBA lending was not exactly what I think would be optimal. Now, the only reason I'm going to cut anybody some slack on this is we're running these programs in 2 weeks. A massive amount of fiscal policy to throw at the economy. And if you looked at the consumption expenditures report from last Friday, in April, the savings rate in this country went to 30+%. So 30% of the income was actually saved in April. What happened there? Well, sure, wages and salaries were down, but the fiscal stimulus was more than enough to recover that on aggregate. So there's this massive surge in spending, or excuse me, there's this massive surge in income, and you couldn't spend it. So of course, if you have this massive surge in income and you can't spend it, savings rates go through the roof. And that's exactly what happened. It was, we're talking normally savings rates are like 7 or 8%. They suddenly go to 30%, or 6 or 7%. They suddenly go to 30%. That's amazing. So maybe it's not a bad thing that we don't see my charts, because they all look silly right now anyway. They're just crazy stuff like that going on. So I think we have the kinds of federal support that's necessary to prevent deflation, because eventually people are able to spend. Well, we wanted to make sure that they were capable of spending when they got to that point. They had the income to spend. If they have the income to spend, then firms will have the ability to rehire, and we'll be able to work the economy back up into some more normal activities, at least as normal as we can get to, given this new situation. So that's the right policy. Unfortunately, again, a lot of small mid-sized firms might not make it through this. The way PPP worked is it benefited firms that were most likely to limp along anyway. So that's, again, not the greatest, and that will delay the recovery on the other side. What we also need to do is think about how we extend these programs. I think that when those programs were initiated, they were for a fairly short term. It's turned out to be a longer event. So we're going to have to think about how we extend the unemployment insurance in such a way that it doesn't detract from work incentives. I don't think that that's really too high of a priority of a concern, but it's something that should be thought of. We should phase out the enhanced unemployment benefits by when you meet economic objectives. So when unemployment falls to X%, then we start phasing out these benefits, and then we can sort of more normalize the economy over time. We really need state and federal aid in order to prevent further declines in activity from cuts to basically state and local employment. So that's really something that needs to come out in the next, I would say in the next month, because we're going to start seeing that more broadly. Oregon's actually in a little bit better position because we have reserves, so that's good. And also because in Oregon, increase, so we actually had some additional funding coming into the system anyway with the corporate activities tax. So Oregon is going to see some budget cutting, certainly because the revenue path is lower. The situation could have been a whole lot worse than it is. Some other states basically had no reserves to start with, and will be hit with a massive cut in income. So, we did pretty well this time, all things considered. So I'm pretty happy about that. Let's see. I'm just trying to make sure I made it through all of my main points, but I think I've got them. Another question that people ask me is, do we think that there's going to be some big changes on the other side of this? And that's a huge question. I'm somebody that's wary of too many big changes. I think behavior is somewhat sticky. People like to do things they were doing a year ago and will like to do them a year from now. They're going to try to figure out a way to do them. How we do that might be differently. We might have less business travel as we have more of this stuff, the Zoom stuff, but it still doesn't completely replace that in-person contact. Another point is we've been talking about how the internet would replace the need for big cities for literally decades since the internet came along. And what we saw is the internet actually intensified the densification of many of our big cities. Again, there was something about that creative energy that could only be maintained for in-person contact. So it's not clear to me that we'll not have that stuff going forward, because we seem to get a lot of that stuff. Other questions about commuting, about where do you live? Do you live in the city? Do you live in the suburbs now, right? Do you live in New York City anymore? Well, what's the point if all the cool stuff isn't there, right? If there's no restaurants, there's no entertainment, why would live in the big city? Becomes a question, certainly. I've seen reports from firms in Portland that say, the sort of quote unquote funniest one I saw was some firm that was reporting that half of their employees rode the Max and the other half biked to work, and the half that rode the Max don't want to ride the Max anymore, and the half that bike commute don't want to work with people that ride with the Max because they don't want the possibility of that transmission going on, right? So the people that ride the Max want a parking subsidy to come to work. So you got sort of some weird things like that that are inconsistent with what we saw evolving. So I suspect that certain things are going to accelerate. There's probably going to be more of this Zoom stuff. There's probably going to be more delivery. So in the retail trade sector, it might be harder to reinvigorate parts of that sector because we'll do more online delivery services. I don't know how often I'll go to Costco anymore, right? Instead of going every week, maybe I go once a month. And the other 3 times a week, 3 times a month, somebody's just going to deliver it to me, right? So those are options too. Travel and tourism should be constricted for some time until we grow our way around this. But I also believe that people like to do those things, and they're going to try to find a way to do that going forward. So things will be different. I just don't know how much, because behavior can be so sticky. So we're still learning how we get to that next point. So it's probably taken me somewhere around 20 minutes or so, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground there, and actually kind of went over some of the things that I was going to ask about, but I know that Will there has some questions for you. So I'll pass it to you, Will. What questions do you have?
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. That was fantastic. I appreciate that. How quickly you covered so much ground. It took away a few of my questions. One of the questions that I did get when I queried some listeners was, you know, we both at the state and at the federal level, we have now run up an almost unfathomable amount of debt to fund this crisis that we've been in. And what do tax rates and paying this back, what is, in your opinion, especially at the state level, what does that look like for us going forward?
Well, at the state level, we can't borrow in the same way. So, you know, I think any borrowing we do will be limited compared to what we do at the federal level. Also, and I made this point during the talk, is that we just had a large tax increase in Oregon, the corporate activities tax. And that covers kind of two parts, two grounds. One is it increased the revenue flow, and it was meant to fix a structural hole in the deficit before we had the next recession. We just got that recession more quickly. So we're not going to be able to expand some spending in schools like we thought we were, but we're going to do better than we would have otherwise. So that is a bit of luck. Also, whenever we have a recession, people say, well, don't we need a sales tax? And then I say, well, the corporate activities tax was supposed to mimic elements of the sales tax. So we already kind of got that too. So I don't know that we have a lot of room in Oregon for raising taxes at this point. So I don't know that there's going to be some big political push given what we just pushed through the system. So that's, I just don't think we're going to have the same situation that we had in the last two, where there's a lot of, last two recessions, where there's a lot of push for higher taxes. So we'll see how that prediction evolves here going forward. But I suspect that's how it's going to fall out. On the federal level, I don't worry about deficits. I know that we're supposed to, and we've been taught that we're supposed to, but the reality is that we haven't seen the problems of deficit spending emerge as many people would have expected. There's been no financial crisis related to the deficit. And the reason is essentially because the deficit is something we can, you know, basically, the Federal Reserve can always buy the debt should financial markets not need to buy the debt. There's not really a problem supporting financially deficit. It's the issue of when federal spending starts to put enough pressure on the economy that you get inflation. So that would be a signal that we were stripping the economy beyond, or we were trying to push the economy beyond the means of the ability to produce. We get inflation, we get higher interest rates. In the last 10 years, our problem has been inflation that's been too low and interest rates that were arguably too low. So we haven't put a lot of pressure on the economy. And I think you can argue that for the last 30, 40 years, we've probably put too little pressure on the economy, underestimated our capacity to produce. And as a result, unemployment has been lower and unemployment has been higher than we really need. And we've probably worsened income inequality issues as well. So when people worry about the debt, I say, look, if you start seeing inflation start to emerge, and I see real inflation, I mean broad-based increases in consumer prices that are in excess of 2% and look likely to rise, then you're probably in a situation where you're outstripping the capacity of the economy to produce. The Federal Reserve will start to raise interest rates under that circumstance, and that's your signal that maybe something in the spending taxes needs to be rebalanced. But under these circumstances, we're just shoveling money out the door. There doesn't seem to be any big inflationary impulse. We're fighting a deflationary or disinflationary impulse, and there's no increase in interest rates and no push from the financial markets to push interest rates higher. So I would say stop worrying so much about the federal deficit and start worrying about the productive capacity of this economy, and have we been underestimating that productive capacity for decades?
Okay.
Anything else?
Does anybody else have any questions before we see if Will has more questions? I'm going to pass it to Terry. Give him a shot here.
Thank you, President Kate. Tim, thank you so much for your presentation. Very helpful. And thank you also for mentioning the hospitality industry, and your words on that were very sombering, but appropriate. So what do you feel it will take for the hospitality community to be able to convince travelers to feel confident and investing in that part of our economy, which is a huge part of our economy? We're seeing unemployment numbers that are just staggering, from servers and bartenders and housekeepers and front desk agents. So how do we get consumers to invest again? And if you can't answer that as an economist, how do you answer that as a traveler yourself?
Well, that's the issue there is getting the public health concerns minimized. So in this case, your real challenge in that sector is getting people willing to go out in the economy and operate. They have the money right now, at least in aggregate, the money's out there. There's a desperate demand for it. People really do like that kind of activity. They just don't feel comfortable doing it yet because they're too worried about the public health issues. So you really need I would say a more robust testing, tracing, tracking procedure. You need to have more knowledge of how the virus transmits. You're going to have maybe more therapy. Maybe the virus will evolve into something that's less catastrophic, and that would be helpful. But I think really it's all on the public health side that we have to work on before we're going to be willing to do tourism and travel. I think that's especially for the eating and drinking part of it, because again, those are large crowds, densely packed, and now we know too how much in a poorly circulated air ventilated space the virus could spread fairly quickly. So even an hour or two in a restaurant with one infectious person could spread it to a number of people. You get these super spreader events. Or a recent event in South Korea where one individual that was infectious went to a number of nightclubs. And a nightclub is another one of those. You're all hot, sweaty, and breathing right next to each other. It just boom, you're there. So until we can understand how those events work better, I don't think households or individuals are going to be very comfortable with that kind of event. So in the short run, things we can do is we can limp through the summer probably an outdoor that would probably help a lot if you have lots of open air, widely spaced. So if your cities wanted to use parks as restaurants, and then sort of minimize the number of people in or limit the number of people in, and you can probably do something like that. You're going to have to find ways to do that because people are not going to stay in their houses forever. So we need a public health system that is able to grow the economy around the virus, and that's where we need to head. My understanding is that hotels are actually not that much of a problem. You wipe down the rooms, air out the rooms, that's not where your issues are. It's really, again, crowds of people packed together is where your issues really are. And I could travel, stay in a hotel, but I still have to eat. So the hotel is only part of the equation. So that's the thing. Some of these goods are not substitutes, right? They're costs, right? So in order to do the hotel travel, I need to have a place to eat and do the restaurant travel or some other activity, right? So, if we could just shut down one part of the economy and just shift all that demand and supply into another part of the economy, we wouldn't have had any problems, right? We just reorganize the economy along different lines. We can't do that because there's too many goods that are complements, they're not substitutes.
All right. Anybody else? Will, do you have or David, do you have any questions at all? So I'm going to pass it back to Will.
Okay, I do have one question. In your comments, you noted that there were the savings rate was up to 30%, and historically it's in the sixes or something like that here. During the Great Depression, that scarred a generation and a subsequent generation from spending. They were spendthrifts for the rest of their lives. Has this period been too short for that to change our behavior that drastically, and when do you see that 30% savings being spent back down to our regular rate?
So if we manage the economy right, we should not we should not basically scar people the way we did in the Great Depression. You know, there was nothing wrong with the economy in January. Literally nothing wrong with it. I mean, we can talk about broad social issues and inequality, but from a broad macroeconomic perspective, we had no big problems. It's not like in 2007 where we knew we were coming off this massive housing bubble, or in 2001 when we knew we were coming off this massive technology investment bubble. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing, no sector of the economy that needs to be around this time. Really, in theory, we could rebound this economy fairly quickly if we could learn to grow around the virus. By giving people the means to spend now, it prevents them from being scarred severely. So the unemployment insurance is a great way to do that and prevent that. Now, as that, again, support drops off, you know, for example, we're not doing the tax rebates again, most likely, or certainly not to that size. That means the income flow is going to go down and saving rates are going to start to fall in the months ahead. Back towards something normal. But once people can start to spend and some of those federal supports start to ease off, then we're going to see savings come back down. The reason the Depression had such scarring events is there was no system of support for incomes the way there is now. So you had 30% unemployment without the unemployment insurance. That didn't come along until later in the Great Depression. So that's where you got the really big scarring. You know, the unemployment insurance system did not work optimally here. So you saw Oregon's director of the Oregon Employment Department was fired over the weekend because of challenges there. All states really, I shouldn't say all, most states had some kind of challenge because most states have terribly antiquated technology. Some states, the design of the system was to prevent people from applying for benefits. Another problem, though, is that even if you have the best designed system, would you ever design a system to handle the number of claims that were 10 times the number of claims you got at the worst of the Great Recession, right? There's just the numbers here are just beyond you know, beyond any sort of historical precedent. So. But money moving out, you know, a couple of weeks late for a lot of people. We've added people to the system that haven't been there before. That's a huge support for the economy that should prevent some of that scarring that you're talking about there. Now, if this drags on for 2 or 3 years, you know, we're going to have more of a change in behavior. But for me, again, it's how quickly we can rebound this. It's gonna make that difference.
Okay. Oh, there's a lot to chew on, but a lot of information that I definitely did not have before I heard from you today. So thank you so much, Tim, for taking the time to be a participant in our Rotary meeting today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Okay, so fellow Rotarians, if you, when you're watching this video, if you have any comments or questions that you would like to have either go back to Tim or have discussion with each other, please do watch the video on our Facebook page and you can put questions in there. That would be great. We could have a conversation there about the things that Tim has brought up. Next week, our keynote speaker is to be determined, so keep an eye out on the website as well as in the newsletter, in the Spokes newsletter that you'll receive at the end of the week. I want to thank all the speakers who participated today and welcome back Terry. Very excited he's back. And I would like to also thank you, our club's membership. So wherever it is that you may be viewing this meeting, I hope that you might be watching this perhaps with your family or sharing the video with your friends so that they can not only understand what Rotary is, but also what Rotary does in fellowship and in service. We have been doing a few things over these many weeks of the COVID-19 virus as we stay in. So some fellowship opportunities, a little reminder again, is 10 a.m. on Tuesdays and Fridays. We host a coffee room for folks to just show up and check in and have their coffee and see how each other is doing, as well as a Thursday social at 4 p.m. where we have a fellow Rotarian who gives us some expert insight into what is going on in their industry and allows also for other members to ask them some questions. If you'd like to participate in either of those, please just contact the office to get the Zoom info so you can be there and participate. And I also realizing that I want to make sure you all know that Rotarian Angel Pilato, that she has been doing a whole Rotarian recipe gathering. People have been taking photos, and she's kind of just making this wonderful group that is going to, maybe perhaps we're going to put it together in a book of some sort at the end, but we'll see how that goes. But for right now, we're having a good time sharing recipes. And again, contact Angel Pilato if you would like to participate in that and you missed it the first time it may have come through your inbox. Lastly, don't forget about the committee quick chats. I spoke to a ton of different committee representatives, and if you have interest in what any of the committees are doing right now, you can go see those on the committee quick chat section, the playlist on our YouTube channel. There's a great one right now up there that I did with membership chair Reed Miller, where he kind of does a bit of a call out letting you know what you can do as a member at different levels to keep up the fellowship of our club, as well as how we're presenting Rotary right now out into the community. As always, take care of you, take care of yours. It's been a crazy few months and a crazy few days. So why don't you reach out to a Rotarian this week? Perhaps just one or a few, but just one. Continue our service work so that when we say that we are committed to service above self, it is more than a motto. It is a Rotarian value to uphold. Thank you so much. This meeting is adjourned.